Thanks again for great presentations all around. So I want to let you all ask some questions. But before we do that, I'd like to see a sign of hands. How many of you work for publishing houses and are here to learn about how publishers work with preprints? That's great. That's almost the whole room. How many people here work for technology vendors that are working in that space? Some of you. Great. Thank you for being here. How many of you are researchers? And there are a few researchers in the room. Great. That is the audience that we were hoping to attract with this. So thank you very much. Does anybody have any questions for the panelists? Yeah, go ahead.
This might be Hannah Heckner with AAAS Science. As more publishers start to bring on the preprint transfer, is it something that we need to be concerned with in regards to the license of the preprint and what the license of the final published manuscript would be? Since there's a separate DOI, is that a completely separate licensing concern? What's the conversation surrounding that?
Ooh, you jump in with a big one. I'm not answering that.
I can take a somewhat inadequate stab at that, I think. I think you've put your finger on a slightly gray area, not so much from the DOI perspective. I mean, our friends at Crossref have sorted that out for us. But it's hard, it's easy to go from a restrictively licensed preprint to anything else when the final version of the paper is published. At the moment, there seem to be some obstacles at certain journals to the idea that a preprint was given, say, a CC BY license, and the journal has some other way of handling that, typically the transfer of copyright to the publisher or to the journal. I'm only aware of one particular journal where this has actually been a problem, and I know the folks at the journal, and they are considering what to do about that. But at the moment, I think that's a slightly unresolved issue, and it would be a matter for the community to really talk about. And of course, a publisher like PLOS, which believes in CC BY anyway, has the different perspective, perhaps.
Jessica?
Just wanted to add that ASAP Bio is organizing a task force around this issue of licensing. And we have on that some legal scholars who are interested in how derivative works can be licensed differently, because clearly there's a separate copyright for any additional work. But I think that the attitudes of many different types of stakeholders, and especially journals, is something that we would love to learn more about. And
on this point. And I think that there's a reason for the confusion. I think the licenses definitely create blurry lines. And we have our lawyer on staff, as well as one of our board members who's also a lawyer, have looked at this, but in every case they've always said this is a gray area. And so I think that one of the things, in addition to Jessica's, the task force that they've put together, we're also putting together educational materials around this so that it is more clear, because the truth is that authors really just don't know the answer. And to be fair, when you ask a question, we don't know the answer. So I think that does need to be established. There does need to be some more examples so that we can be more clear. But there's always the question of, if the exact same article is a preprint and then word for word shows up in a journal, which license prevails? And that's part of the tough question. If it's vastly different, then it's easier. But for the most, and then comes the question of how different do they need to be? So stay tuned. It's a really good question.
Maybe I could just add that, one of the reasons that we chose right from the beginning to offer authors the widest possible range of licenses, including the opportunity to say no, all rights reserved, no sharing under any circumstances, was because of our kind of concern that this this, I mean, right at the beginning, what we were trying to do was to overcome what we perceived to be anxieties amongst the research community and barriers to adoption to preprints. And it seemed to us to be prudent to give authors the maximum opportunity to put whatever license they felt was appropriate on a preprint. Going forward, I think, though, you know, as the community gets more comfortable with these things, then we're committed to the idea of having as open licensing for preprints as is possible. But possible is very much to do with how comfortable the community feels about it and some resolution of the kind of problems that Louise and Jessica talked about.
Great. There was a question. Yes, sir. That's you. Yeah.
Okay, so what I wanted to ask was the different panelists, what they thought the best relationship between the preprint server and the journal or the publisher should be. If we look at the example of archive.org, essentially we have a single preprint server serving a subject community, which is essentially separate from journals. What they have in common is that the author interacts with both. But from a governance point of view, although there may be some interoperability between them, they're kept relatively separate. So what's the best relationship, or what are the different pros and cons of there being quite a separate relationship or quite a close one between preprints, archives and journals?
That's good.
We know what you think.
Yeah, Louise has said, we know what you think. Yeah, I think you're absolutely spot on about the relationship between archive and journals. And in fact, Paul Ginsberg, the founder of Archive, is on record as saying that he is totally amazed that journals in physics and mathematics still exist after 25 years of archive. We took a different view right from the beginning, as I said in my remarks, that we felt that it was important that preprints be integrated into the journal publishing community, and we could envision a variety of ways in which that might happen, and some of that has already happened, but there are other ways which have yet to be developed, which will be interesting to explore as well. I think part of the problem in the beginning, as I think Jessica said, you know, journals have evolved over the course of the last 3 or 4 years. They've evolved their policies, or they've clarified their policies, and the ones that remain antipathetic to preprints, as Lisa alluded to, are the journals that are closer to clinical medicine. The cancer journals are a particular example. I know the AACR gets a lot of stick on Twitter from its members for not being preprint friendly, but their concern is about protecting ultimately the patient. And I think preprints in clinical medicine are a very complicated matter and something that we are very interested in exploring, but it's not a very simple thing to see one's way through at this point. So, I mean, long rambling answer to your question, but I think there is every reason for preprints to be as integrated as possible with journals, because preprints will never provide the kind of certification that only journals can do through processes of peer review, which, who knows, could get better as the years go on because of the existence of preprint servers as you separate the certification of content with the dissemination of content. That's essentially what preprints allow you to do.
So the only thing I would add there, Stephen, is that I completely agree that with the integration, because having authors do something additional when they're already very busy is not a good thing. And so if we can somehow make it easier for them to interact with all different kinds of research communication, whether it's the commenting or whether it's the figures or whether it's the data that is associated with the article. If there's a way for them to work within one ecosystem, even joined up with their authoring system, that is a boon for them. It's a time saver. It is a means of keeping the research record intact. And I think that, where I would take Paul's comment even one step further. I'm surprised journal article shapes still exist, because research is not article shaped. And so yet we continue to force authors to create these research products. So preprints is just another, morph, if you will, of the research and how it's getting communicated. And we as publishers need to react to that. And so making that easy, either through the mechanics or through the workflows, is our job, because that's why we're here.
Lisa?
I would just add that from what we've heard from Broad researchers, they see our preprint servers and peer-reviewed journals as both critical parts of the scientific publishing workflow. And what they've really done is looked for the best both worlds in coming up with concurrent submission policies and things like that to have what they perceive as de-risking the process from that standpoint.
Great. Jessica, anything to add?
No.
Okay.
I mean, I completely agree that I think this form validation is totally necessary, so.
Great. In the back?
Thank you very much for the excellent talk. Any numbers on what is in preprint but doesn't get published? Is it significantly different domain-wise, say physics or bio or humanities? And what happens to that data? Is it available freely, aggregated freely?
So from Archive, there is a paper that I mentioned, published in 2014, and also first appearing as a preprint in 2013, that for preprints that are over about 5 years old, I think something like 73% of them can be matched to a paper on the Web of Science. I don't know if that is the same for bioRxiv or other preprint servers, but of course there's a shorter history there.
Yeah, I was struck by that number in Jessica's presentation. So on bioRxiv, if we look 2 years out from posting, 60% of the manuscripts that have been published in journals that using the technique that we use for finding those matches, and we may miss some if the final version of the paper mutates a long way away from the version that's on bioRxiv. But that 60% has been pretty robust for the entire life of the server. So I'm very curious about that 40%. Some of them are the studies that were labeled by their authors as contradictory or confirmatory, and we know those papers are not going to find their way into journals particularly. There's a small but I think growing and interesting group of papers on bioRxiv where the authors have said, okay, this is it. This is our final statement on this matter, and we're not proposing to send it to a journal. I would like to find a way of flagging that for the reader's benefit. We haven't done that yet, but I think it would be an interesting thing to do. And the motivations of those authors is something that we haven't really dug into in any great depth. But some of it is, I mean, obviously you have to be at a certain stage in your career if you can sort of carelessly say, oh, well, I'm just going to leave it there, right? It's not something that's going to help your tenure committee application. But it seems to happen on certain occasions.
I would just add that PLOS is a co-author with a number of other publishers. In one of those examples of papers,
That's right.
PLOS collaborated with eLife and Springer Nature, IMBO Journal, and some others to talk about journal citation distribution and why that's a better metric about journal quality than an impact factor. And it was posted on bioRxiv because that's where it's available to read, and none of those journals that were represented in the authorship needed to publish it in those individual journals. Yeah, over there.
I'm just curious, part of bioRxiv in particular, the 11,000 submissions, what percentage have received a useful, substantial, improved?
I'm sorry, I'm not hearing you. Could you?
Yep.
Yellow, American Society of Hematology.
Yeah.
11,000 submissions with bioRxiv. I'm just curious the percent, maybe it's changed over time too, of the submissions that have actually received a substantial or
That's a very good question, of course, and rather critical to the whole enterprise. We haven't done a mass reader survey to dig into that in any proper way. Anecdotally, and we hear through social media and by direct contact with authors, that they get a lot of very useful feedback. I mean, I'm sure not everybody does, but people do remark on that. It doesn't show up, though, often in the comments on bioRxiv. Sometimes it does. It's very partly depends on the discipline. People who are interested in human evolution seem very keen to discuss that publicly. Other subjects, not so much. But what most people say is that they get a lot of private correspondence through email. People talk to them at meetings and so on. So it's hard for me to really answer your question in a quantitative way, but I think I think a lot of this kind of improvement is happening, and I would love to find a way of both surfacing it, and maybe our annotation project will help do that, or quantify it in some other way through an author survey.
Jessica?
Just want to add that my latest preprint, we actually received a very incredibly substantive review by email. It was completely fair, but the person who sent it to us also said, I don't want to post this publicly because I don't want to be seen as too picky. So I think that there's kind of a social barrier, even if the review is very, actually socially acceptable. So.
Right. Judy had a question.
Judy Luther, Informed Strategies. Ever since arXiv launched, people have observed that maybe there was something unique about physics, that preprints worked for them and not for other disciplines. And now we're seeing a huge proliferation of preprint servers in many different disciplines. What are your thoughts on a path to some form of, hate to use the word standardization, best practices, commonalities, so that at the end of the day, this is kind of an evolving discussion. I realize it's early days to be nailing things down. On the other hand, given the interest in data mining and other sorts of activities, I can see that it would be very beneficial to have some guidelines for servers to say, yes, you can launch a new server and here are the best practices that you should adhere to in order to be able to have these capabilities for your readers. So I just wondered what your thoughts are about a path, and how long you think it might take to achieve that.
Well, I think that the meeting that John mentioned where multiple preprint servers are going to come together and talk about best practices is going to go a long way toward creating commonality. I think from the perspective of ASAP Bio and the biomedical sciences, certainly some funders are playing a role in requesting standards as well too. The NIH policy is very detailed in the licenses that are recommended, the preservation of the long-term preservation of these manuscripts, their identification with the DOI, et cetera. But I think that there is a need for an ongoing conversation in various communities, I think, about what it even means to be a preprint. And I think that is something that will need to kind of be ongoing, especially as this evolves.
Can I add something?
Sure.
Yeah.
Part of that question was actually thinking about long-term preservation.
Yes.
Yeah.
Which is, it has been part of the insurance of digital journals, but appears to remain an open question.
Yes.
Sure.
I thought the thrust of your question was going to be about the different behaviors of scholars in different disciplines, and there were some fairly high-profile failures to establish preprint servers in biomedicine over much of the life of arXiv. And biomedical scientists were always inclined to say, oh, well, that's because physicists are different. And physicists would say, well, how the hell are we different? and biomedical scientists would say things like, well, you're not as competitive as us, which was guaranteed to really piss them off.
Yes, exactly. Great. Well, before we close, I wanted to ask you all a question. So we've heard from a few researchers, a research institution, and a research advocate. We've heard from a couple of publishers and a preprint service provider, all giving enthusiastic presentations about preprints. I want to know, is there anybody in the audience now that still has reservations about preprints? Do you still have concerns? A few? Okay. If we keep talking about it, will that help? Great. Well, that's all we have time for. I want to give another round of applause to the panel today. John, Louise, Lisa, Jessica, thank you so much. And thank you all for coming and weathering the collapsing ceiling. You get a round of applause too.